Hi everyone, I'm Catherine Sorsdahl, and in this video we're going to be talking about cohort studies. This figure shows all the different types of research designs. As you can see here, there is quantitative and qualitative research, and under quantitative research there are both experimental studies and observational studies. Cohort studies are one of the three types of observational studies. When evaluating or preparing to conduct an observational study, including cohort studies, there are at least 10 things to consider. Do keep these in mind as we explore cohort studies together. So what is a cohort study? Well, cohort studies are a type of longitudinal study. The word cohort means a group of people. So a cohort is a group of people with common characteristics. This could be young women aged 13 to 20 years of age who have been pregnant or never been pregnant, or perhaps even twins born in 2010. We start by recruiting a group of people who do not have the outcome or condition of interest. For example, people living with HIV without any depression at the start of the study. So essentially we recruit all participants who are free from the outcome condition being investigated. Next, we would assess their exposure status while we follow them up until they develop the disease or do not develop the disease. When critically evaluating or conducting a cohort study, there are a few key features that need to be considered. So what can cohort studies be used for? Well, first, cohort studies can be used to calculate the incidence of a disease. Incident refers to the number of new cases of a specific disease or health outcome that occurs within a defined population during a specific period of time. So cohort studies involve following a group of individuals, the cohort, over a period of time to determine the occurrence of new cases or the incidence of a particular disease or outcome. Second, cohort studies are used to determine associations between the exposure to risk factors and disease over time. While cohort studies can provide strong evidence of an association between an exposure and an outcome, they are generally not sufficient on their own to establish causation. Cohort studies are longitudinal. This means that participants are followed up over an extended period of time to assess the development of outcomes. This really allows the researcher to examine the relationship between the exposure and the outcome over time. Cohort studies can be either prospective or retrospective. So in a prospective cohort study, participants are identified and then followed up from the present into the future. In a retrospective cohort study, researchers gather data from the past records and then follow up participants' histories up to the present. The follow-up period is the time during which participants are observed to determine whether the outcome of interest actually occurs. The duration of the follow-up can vary from months or decades, depending on the research question and the nature of the outcome. Cohort studies are designed to follow a group of individuals, the cohort, over a period of time, collecting data on their exposures and outcomes. This allows researchers to establish the temporal order of events, so we know which one comes first. And this is really valuable in identifying potential causal relationships. Let's use an example. We see high levels of depression in pregnant women in Zimbabwe. So we want to use a cohort study to find out what the risk factors are. So we start with a group of women who have just found out that they're pregnant. We use a screening tool to assess for depression and only include those who do not screen positive in our cohort study. We use a number of questionnaires or screening tools to assess various risk factors or exposures that we think may be causing the depression. Then we assess whether they develop depression at various points in time throughout their pregnancy. At the end of the study, we compare the characteristics of those who had developed depression to see which exposures may be contributing to the outcome, in this case, depression. There are a number of potential pitfalls in cohort studies. First, there is confounding. Even with efforts to control for confounding variables, there may still be unmeasured or unknown confounders that influence the relationship between the exposure and the outcome. Second, unlike randomized controlled trials or experiments, exposure in cohort studies are determined by a non-random process. A major source of error in these cohort studies then is the accuracy of classification of the exposure and disease status. This is called misclassification. In other words, you may misclassify someone as having the outcome of interest, for example depression, if your tools used to classify or assess the presence of the condition or exposure isn't standardized. It is therefore very important in cohort studies to have a standardized way of assessing for the presence of the disease or the condition and the exposure. Finally, loss to follow-up or dropout is the biggest challenge in cohort studies given their longitudinal nature. This is when members of the cohort drop out over the duration of the study, so we don't know if they develop the disease or not. Knowing the outcome is vital for the success of a cohort study. If there is a systematic or non-random difference between those who drop out and those that stay in the study, this can lead to a biased result. This is why it is so important to minimize the effect of dropout in a cohort study. There are some ways or strategies that can help minimize dropout. You can do this through getting correct contact details and even location information. And regular follow-up is also really important to help establish a relationship between the research team and the participants, particularly if you're following up over years or decades. It's also important to note that because of the longitudinal nature, it can be more difficult to ascertain participants over time or keep them over time in cohort studies compared to other designs. So in summary, there are a lot of strengths and weaknesses to a cohort study. Looking at strengths, you can establish a time order. You can see which variable came first. You can calculate incidence rates. And it's great that you can evaluate many diseases and outcomes at the same time. It's also good for very rare exposures. Because there are no controls, you have less of a selection bias as well. So those are a number of strengths. But there are a number of weaknesses as well. Given the longitudinal nature, it's very lengthy and very costly. You may require a very large sample size, and it's really not suitable for rare diseases or outcomes because you have to keep recruiting until you find the big enough sample. Loss to follow-up is a very big issue, as mentioned, with cohort studies, and of course misclassification bias, as I already mentioned. I hope you found this video helpful and you have more of an idea of the use, strengths, and weaknesses of cohort studies.